Imports and exports. An introduction. Once you've understood the basics of the way a sovereign currency works in the domestic economy, between government or public sector and non-government or private sector, the next question is, what about imports and exports, foreign trade? How does that fit in? We expand the two-sector model to include the rest of the world. We add the foreign sector. In fact, the foreign sector is a sub-sector of the non-government sector. The private domestic sector is the households and businesses of the country, and the foreign sector is all those households, businesses and governments of other countries. That is what makes up the non-government sector. When we say the government deficit is equal to the non-government sector surplus, the non-government sector includes the foreign sector, the rest of the world. Those households, businesses and foreign governments of the foreign sector are also users of the currency and can hold financial assets in our currency. Those governments of the foreign sector may be currency issuers in their own right, but when accounting for the non-domestic economy, they are currency users just like everyone else. The traditional view. We are led to believe that we get rich by selling stuff to people overseas, for which they send us their money. This is spoken of as a good thing. It is based on the way we are taught to fear deficits, and to want a trade surplus, to operate the country as if it were a business and to generate a cash profit. A trade deficit is yet again viewed as a bad thing, in this frame. Like the fear of the domestic public sector deficit, this fear of the trade deficit grew out of gold standard thinking. Under a gold standard, the way a government was able to increase its domestic spending was to acquire more of the foreign currency to which it had promised convertibility. Then the more of its own domestic currency it was able to create and issue. But that is no longer the case. We now use fiat currencies that are free-floating. We do not promise to convert GB pound into US dollar or gold at a fixed rate, and so do not need gold or US dollar reserves in order to finance domestic spending. But we are stuck in that mindset which incorrectly equates exports with real wealth. Thinking in that outdated fashion leads to the recurring idea that a country should export to get rich. Norway is held as an example, exporting oil and amassing an enormous amount of foreign currency in a wealth fund. There are uses for a wealth fund, but it is not necessary to do what Norway has done, and at the scale Norway has done it. Real terms of trade. When a country imports things, real goods and services flow into the country, and currency flows out. When a country exports, foreign currency holdings flow into a country and real goods and services flow out. The correct approach to imports and exports is to focus on the real goods and services that are being imported or exported. These are the real terms of trade. In this context, imports are a benefit and exports are a cost. What does that mean? Surely the importer is losing out to the exporting foreign country. The importer may now have a trade deficit. But that's gold standard thinking. We know that a deficit in the domestic currency is sustainable. The importer receives things of real value in exchange for its fiat currency, which as we know is nothing more than an IOU of the issuing state. The exporter sends things of real value in exchange for the fiat tokens of a foreign country. Trade deficits and surpluses. An importing state may have a fiscal trade deficit if it has imported more than it has exported. In money terms, the importing of goods and services causes a domestic currency leak. Some currency passes out of the domestic money circuit into a foreign entity who are not a resident, active, consuming, tax-paying member of the importing state's economy. The amount of currency circulating in the importing state's domestic economy is therefore reduced. If an importing state is a monetary sovereign with its own fiat currency, any effect that leakage may have on the local economy can be compensated for, e.g. by increased domestic spending, to maintain the private sector domestic surplus. If the state is not a monetary sovereign, e.g. a Eurozone country, it has three options: increase taxation, borrow, sell debt, or increase exports to make up the difference. This alone may help understand why adopting the euro would not be a sensible option for an independent Scotland. An economy that is overly dependent on large amounts of imports will have difficulty maintaining the value of its currency in international exchange. To maintain some sort of balance, It also needs to be able to export goods and services which foreign nations can purchase. The balance of trade does not have to be exact, and it does not need to generate a trade surplus at all, within reason. Not all countries can be net exporters. International trade would never succeed if that were the case. Someone has to be a net importer to make it all work. An exporting country then sends goods and services it produces abroad in exchange for foreign currency. In real terms of trade, this is a cost, not a benefit, because you are using your labor and raw materials to provide another country with things that could be used at home. Or using those human and material resources that could produce other things that the domestic economy would benefit from. There is a trade-off to think about. Common questions. So what makes an exporter want to accept foreign money IOUs in exchange for real goods and services? And why are imports a benefit when the importer is exporting their currency to a foreign country? For one thing, it may want to acquire a foreign currency so that it can use that currency to buy things from the country it sold stuff to. It may want to hold it as forex reserves, investing it by buying the other country's sovereign bonds. But the main reason is that it provides employment and maintains cash flow and profits for the exporting business. They don't mind whose money they take if it pays their bills and increases profits. If receiving things of real value in exchange for an otherwise worthless fiat currency is how it works, why don't we just stop making stuff and just print the money and import everything? Printing your way to prosperity is not how it works. Importing more than you export is okay as far it goes. But if you become reliant on real basics and find yourself becoming totally import dependent, importing foodstuffs and energy, oil, then you really have a problem. Your currency will depreciate on the foreign exchanges. You need to export something to help balance trade. If you can't do that, you need to cut back on imports, carry out import substitution, and invest in your domestic productive capacity.